This week on Inside the Issues, I speak with Mark Raymond on macrohistorical governance change. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Political Science Professor at the University of Waterloo. Every week I'm pleased to welcome an expert on some aspect of global governance here into the studios at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. And this week I'm pleased to welcome Mark Raymond, who's co-lead researcher of the Balsillie School's Ideational Conflict Project, and one of the big thinkers that I like to bring into the studio every once in a while. Sometimes our topics are very nuts and bolts and very practical oriented, and sometimes we step back and have a good hard long look at large-scale political issues. And of course, this is a series on governance. I'm not sure anyone really quite understands what governance is. It's one of those classic hard-to-define concepts, but governance, I guess, at a minimum just means people figuring out a way to solve the problems that they share collectively. And in your work, you've looked in a very interesting way, stepped back through history at how people changed their approaches essentially to governance. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what you were trying to do in your recent research and the kinds of approaches you took.
Right. So one of the things that we immediately notice if we think about history in a very long time frame is that the international system today, the sort of rules and institutions that we have to sort of make public decisions between political communities, so governance, is very different than it looked a couple of hundred or several hundred or 1,000 or more years ago. And it's not immediately obvious, or at least international relations theorists don't have ready, well-accepted answers for when and why those systems, those rules and structures change. So that's what I wanted to look at. I wanted to understand how and why social change occurs, and if we can sort of leverage that knowledge to sort of understand how to either promote or resist certain kinds of political changes that actors may attempt to create. Mm-hmm. The basic insight was that these changes aren't random. People know how to engage in social change, how to pursue social change. So if we think about recent events through 2011, for example, the revolution sweeping the Arab world, so the Arab Spring is one example of potential social change in the international system, as well as at the domestic level in those individual states. We do have at least something potentially very important going on. Another example in the more economic realm is the Occupy movement. So this is a widespread decentralized social movement that is pursuing, or at least attempting to pursue, some kind of change in the rules that govern public life, both at the national and international levels. So the idea was to try and understand how these things happen. The central point is really that it's not random. There are well-established social practices for doing this kind of change, and these social practices are governed by rules.
And your view is that this set of practices is more or less the same, formally speaking, no matter what level of aggregation you're talking about. So if small groups want to change the way they govern themselves, they still go through the same kinds of processes of change that the world goes through at the largest possible level when you have key actors such as states trying to get together and figure out how to reorder the way they do business internationally.
The specific rules are context dependent, so a country club will have different rules than a union will, and will have different rules than the international system does. But the generic idea of rule-governed social practices for creating change is, I think, relatively universal. So yeah, there is a base similarity here. We can identify the same kind of process, even if the specifics of it are different, across very different social contexts, both in terms of level of analysis, so as we climb up the ladder of aggregation to larger and larger political communities, or in the international system case, between political communities. And then it also varies across time and space. So different cultures will do this differently.
But it's all about rules, right?
Yeah, there are, in each case, rules for how you change the rules. So this is the central theoretical insight that draws on the work of a British legal philosopher named H.L.A. Hart. And Hart distinguished between primary rules of behavior on the one hand and secondary rules or meta rules. So a primary rule of behavior is, to use one of Hart's examples, the notion that a man should take off his hat when he enters a church. This was an example that Hart was very fond of, and he called this a rule of etiquette. And this is a primary rule for behavior. On the other hand, secondary rules fall into three categories according to Hart. So there are rules of recognition, which tell us how to determine if a given or an asserted rule is a legitimate one. There are rules of change, which are rules about how we change the rules. And then there are rules of what Hart called adjudication. So one of the things we often are in the position of having to do is figure out how a general rule applies to a particular case. And this is what adjudication is all about in a legal context, which was Hart's main inspiration. But we also actually wind up doing this in everyday sort of social context. So one rule that we all carry around is that we shouldn't lie, or that there are at least a broad range of circumstances in which lying is a bad thing to do. Now the question is, how do we determine if a given speech act constitutes a lie? So is someone lying? We need a way to tell, and there are actually social rules that help us in doing that.
Mm-hmm. Just to make sure that this concept of different kinds of rules is clear, let's bring it really down to earth and localize it a bit. Game of hockey.
Yes.
Every year they change the rules. One year it's all right for the goaltender to handle the puck in the corner behind the net, another year it's not. How does this work? So which rules are changing, and how are the different kinds of rules change, the process of changing different kinds of rules interacting over the course of the evolution of this great game we know is hockey?
Right. So the rule about whether or not the goalie is allowed to play the puck or what areas of the ice the goalie is allowed to play the puck in is a primary rule of the game of hockey. Now, on the other hand, the rulemaking process that operates at the National Hockey League level is governed by secondary rules. So there are voting rules, for instance. There will be certain people who are deemed legitimate representatives of each of the clubs that make up the National Hockey League. And then there will be a competition committee in that particular case that's comprised of a smaller subset that also has representation, I believe, from players as well. So there will be a stake for players independent of their teams.
So people authorized to get to change primary rules.
Yes, exactly. And the National Hockey League's constitution and bylaws clearly spell out the legitimate procedures by which this happens.
Right.
And the upshot of this, the punchline, is that if you try and change the primary rules, for example of hockey, in ways that are consistent with the secondary rules, you're far more likely to be successful. You're far more likely to actually convince other people that they should go along with the rule change that you would like to make. So if you can get yourself elected to the Board of Governors or to the competition committee or the right institutional venue for making that decision, you're more likely to succeed than if you simply go down to the ACC in Toronto and wave a picket sign outside of it.
Right, like abolish headshots entirely.
Yes,
It's
exactly.
a unilateral coup. All right, well, very good. We'll be back in just a minute to continue our conversation on macro-historical governance change with Mark Raymond. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So shifting from hockey to international politics, at various times, not that often, I guess, so it would be fair to say that the rules change fairly dramatically. That you can obviously point to a period of time, describe it in one way as a system governed by a certain set of primary rules, and then at another time, another system governed by another set of primary rules, different in some degree. So it's those intervening times that are particularly interesting, aren't they? The times in which there's some attempt to make fundamental changes in how the game works, and interesting debate about how and why that happens. What are some of the historical examples of those inflection points, those periods of dynamic argumentation about how the rules should be that you're especially interested in and that you think are especially insightful for understanding processes of system change?
There are a couple in particular that I think it might be fun to talk about a little bit. The first is the interwar period and the Kellogg-Briand Pact in particular. And this is a treaty that has a very bad name in history, and a very bad name in sort of the received wisdom about how international politics works, because this was a treaty concluded in 1928 that banned the use of war as an instrument of national policy. This was a fundamental change in the rules of the international system, because for most of what we call the classic Westphalian period, states had been perfectly within their rights to decide when they were going to go to war. and states could go to war for bluntly self-interested reasons and purposes, and there was no legal restriction on this. This was a perfectly acceptable and even normal part of international politics. And in 1927 and 28, you have the negotiation ultimately of a multilateral treaty that includes almost every state in the international system that bans the use of war. So this is an abrupt change, it's an important change, and most interestingly, I think, it was an unintended change. When we think about social change and the ways we alter our rules of governance, we tend to imply or assume a high degree of intentionality. Mm-hmm. This is something people really try to do. It turns out that's not always the case. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was intended by neither of the men whose name it bears. The proposal originates in a French diplomatic sally that was really badly conceived. It was made directly to the press instead of through normal diplomatic channels. And so for several months, the Americans weren't even really clear that the French were proposing a treaty, and if so, what form it would take. So eventually the French are forced to clarify this and say that yes, we actually were really serious about this.
What were they initially trying to do? What was the original idea? The
initial idea was simply to conclude a bilateral treaty between France and the U.S. that would commit both states not to go to war against the other. And the appropriate context here is the aftermath of World War I and French attempts to gain security against German irredentism, or a German attempt to overturn the Treaty of Versailles. And the French knew already that the Americans wouldn't sign an alliance treaty with them, but they were trying at least to commit the Americans to stay out of a war in continental Europe on the opposite side of France. So this was the goal. And the Americans fairly easily saw through this. It was quite transparent what this was once the French clarified their proposal. But the problem was the Americans felt constrained. They didn't feel they were actually able to say no. So there was a problem politically in saying no, because there was a very active domestic peace movement in the United States that had gotten on board with this, in part because the French agitated them.
And nobody wanted to be seen saying, we reserve the right to go to war with France.
Yes, exactly, especially in the aftermath of what had been, up to that point, the world's most destructive war by far.
Where the United States and France fought on the same side.
Exactly, right. So in this sort of context where they couldn't say no, they had to find a creative way to say yes, but appear sort of reasonable while killing the proposal, convincing the French to back off. And the way the Americans decided they would try and do this is by saying that they would be happy to sign such a treaty renouncing war, but they could only do it with France if they were able to do it with every other state. So this was something that had to be universalized to be diplomatically acceptable.
The idea was basically to kill it.
Yes.
Set it up to fail. And many people would say it did fail, right? I mean, the Kellogg-Briand Pact has an international historian's reputation as being maybe the all-time worst example of treaty making, because nobody basically paid attention to it. Not in the sense the letter of the treaty required, because lots of countries afterwards went and waged war.
Right.
Now, your view, as I understand it, is actually the treaty had important effects, and largely positive effects that go unnoticed. What are some of those?
That's right. So the Stimson Doctrine, in response largely to Japanese aggression in Manchuria in the early 1930s, was explicitly made with reference to the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It was the notion that the United States would not recognize as legitimate any border changes that happened as the result of aggressive warfare. Mm-hmm. This was interesting and different because previously in the international system's history, there had been tons of border changes that were achieved precisely in that manner, through aggression. And the United States had even benefited from such changes. They acquired a massive amount of territory from Spain in the Spanish-American War, for instance. Mm-hmm. So this was conduct that even the United States had engaged in relatively recently and was now saying was completely illegal and completely illegitimate. Many other countries actually endorsed the Stimson Doctrine. It was not something that only the United States did in some quixotic American response to the vagaries of international politics. And what's more, the basic substance and content of the rule in the Kellogg-Briand Treaty is unproblematically adopted and endorsed in the Charter of the United Nations after World War II. So the basic rule turned out to be very popular. Even though it was initially violated quite frequently in the 1930s in its early history, the rule survives the violations and in fact is even strengthened. One of the key purposes of the United Nations, of course, was to provide more effective enforcement machinery precisely for this rule against aggressive warfare in the international system.
I suppose we will never know for sure, but is it plausible in your view that the reason why we've seen interstate war declining fairly steadily since World War II might have something to do with the fact that this norm was promoted accidentally in the Kellogg-Briand Pact?
I think that's probably the case. The problem methodologically, as you point out, is that there are other sort of interfering causes, and prime among them, of course, is nuclear deterrence.
Right.
And it's difficult to sort of pull apart the effect and figure out how much is the Kellogg-Briand norm and how much is nuclear deterrence. We can start to do that, though, and there are reasons, I think, to be more positive about Kellogg-Briand than we have been, because nuclear deterrence doesn't explain the lack of war between two non-nuclear states. Right? So there are lots of potential wars that could have happened and arguably didn't. Now, we're always still in the realm of counterfactuals here, but I think it's at least an interesting argument to have.
Very, very much so. We'll be back again in a moment with Mark Raymond. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So, Mark, the big macro-historical conflict that's been of concern to everybody in the last decade or so is the new global war on terror in particular. As Sam Huntington tried to pitch it, the clash of civilizations between the Islamic world and the West, a characterization that I think is deeply and badly flawed, but nevertheless there is a conflict at least between a small group of radical, clearly radical, and even in the Muslim world not especially popular Islamists, led by Al-Qaeda as an organization, Wahhabists effectively,
Yes.
and liberal Democrats, some of whom have taken this as a particularly salient dimension of international conflict today and have basically diverted the world's attention to this particular battle. So, another big struggle on our hands, even though it's not quite World War I or World War II. What's going on here from your perspective in terms of arguments about how the world should work? Is this one of these classic ideational struggles between two different ways of organizing politics?
I think that that's absolutely a big part of what's going on here. And in fact, both Al-Qaeda and the Bush administration in the early period just after 9/11 explicitly recognized that. If you take a careful look at the rhetoric of actors on both sides, both of them say that they are fundamentally arguing about the future of the international system. And they have very different visions for it, of course. So Al-Qaeda in particular is a little bit unclear, and especially with issues of translation, but it's almost certain that they're after a couple of things. They would like to uphold a very strong norm against interference in sovereign prerogatives of states, particularly Islamic states, and on some interpretations are even advocating the creation of what they call a caliphate, which in historical context can be understood in several ways. One way to understand it would be to be simply a very large state encompassing all Muslims, or at least all Muslim majority countries, with a single ruler, a single defense policy, and a single currency. They've been explicit about those things. So one argument is that Al-Qaeda is trying to create a caliphate. The question then is how that would interface with other states in the international system. Al-Qaeda, again, is very clear that interference inside the Islamic political community by the international system is not welcomed, and it's something that they feel motivated enough to violently resist. So this is their argument about the future of the international system. It's not a complete one, but there are at least some things that they clearly want to change.
And that particular principle is not one that everybody would disagree with outside the Muslim world. So, for example, Russia and China are well known to be very sensitive to violations of sovereignty, to interference in their internal affairs by others, and they're very hesitant to endorse interventions in various places around the world that could set precedents that could backfire against them. So that particular primary rule that Al-Qaeda would like to establish. It doesn't sound especially revolutionary.
That's right, and in some ways it amounts to turning back the clock. But that notion really actually shows us how far the international system has come and how much we, in practice, have qualified sovereignty with various different kinds of international institutions, with various different kinds of international rules restricting what states are able to do. Human rights norms, in particular, are very controversial from Al-Qaeda's perspective. They also make principled arguments that democracy is fundamentally incompatible with Islam. So there are other subsidiary rules that Al-Qaeda is also seeking to change. The broad sort of notion here, though, is that they insist governance be compliant with very strict interpretations of Sharia and Islamic law in particular. And in contrast, the Bush administration tried to assert a very small c conservative view of world order in which they attempted to make common cause with Russia and China, interestingly, on anti-terror policies. So they attempted to enlist a new great power concert, and there were even allusions to exactly that kind of language in the Bush administration's rhetoric. The key, though, is that Al-Qaeda and the Bush administration turned out to be almost completely unable to talk to one another about these proposals. Both sides sort of attempt to make conversation with the other side and its audience, but it founders precisely because they do not agree on the legitimate rules for rulemaking and interpretation. So there is a lack of agreement on secondary rules that almost completely shuts down discussion on primary rules even before it can get started. So the notion of having some kind of compromise here or some kind of alteration or incremental modification of the international system that could prevent violence is completely off the table because neither side knows how to do it. They do not know how to argue with each other about these issues. What they do instead is simply fall back on their cultural prior rules. So Al-Qaeda uses Quranic passages and the Sunnah and the Hadith, so very traditional Islamic modes of argumentation about rulemaking. And on the other hand, the Bush administration employs somewhat controversial versions of international legal and diplomatic rules, and actually faces some criticism from the broader international community for their unilateralist policies in particular.
Right, and those are rules that have long since lost any connection to any kind of religious tradition. They're no longer anchored in any kind of religious tradition, broadly secular.
Yes.
So your view would be that the essence of this macro-historical conflict we're still in the middle of at the moment is that it's a religious secular clash that doesn't provide any space for negotiation over secondary rules?
I'm not sure if I would say strongly that it provides no space. I would say that right now we don't have agreement on a legitimate set of secondary rules that everyone in the international system can buy into. What we have are a set of international rules that have evolved out of the European international system as it went global throughout the 19th century. And the problem is that we've never renovated those rules to take account of decolonization and of the fact that we now have independent states with wildly different cultural and political traditions and whose views are not taken into account when we try and figure out how to reason about international rulemaking. And as a result, we see some backlash, and Al-Qaeda is not the only manifestation of it. It's the most violent one so far, but it is not the only manifestation of potential backlash. The Third World, for example, during the Cold War, was very concerned with international rulemaking and saw the need for deep reform of the UN system and attempted to pursue that, unfortunately, largely unsuccessfully because they simply didn't have the power to make that happen.
Right, and were they operating within the secondary rules established by the great powers, the traditional European?
To a large extent, yes. There was a learning process that had gone on throughout the colonial and immediate post-colonial period where elites in former colonies were actually taught international law and were taught diplomacy and were taught these kinds of skills and rules that the international system had traditionally used.
Right.
Yeah.
Fascinating. We'll be back one more time with Mark Raymond. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So let's step forward, now that we've stepped back and looked at history through a one end of the microscope. We'll look at it through the other end of the microscope. Now we're at a point in time where we're trying to basically improve global governance in every possible way, and in your view that would mean improving agreement on how global governance is decided, how primary rules are set. How do we do this? What do we need to do? What do we have to pay attention to if we want to try to reduce these disagreements over secondary rules and improve the ability of people with different interests to agree on primary rules?
Right. So I think the key payoff here, the key step that we need to take is to be much more explicitly aware of what our procedural rules are. Throughout most of the international system's relatively recent history, we've simply been able to take these rules for granted because the people who are making governance decisions are specialists in international law and diplomacy, and there is and has been no serious disagreement about what the procedural rules are. With globalization, with decolonization, we've seen the massive expansion and democratization in some sense of global rulemaking, of global governance. And despite that democratization, opening it to non-Western peoples, opening it to individuals and civil society even within Western states, there's been no attempt, or at least no sustained attempt, to really consciously think about and renovate our procedural rules of international law and diplomacy largely. And I think that there is a good case to be made that we ought to really start studying these things very self-consciously, and in particular that we ought to be open to renovating them. We ought to be open to doing multilateralism differently, for instance, so being more culturally inclusive with how our multilateral rulemaking processes work. And we may need to take several more steps back and really think about what that would mean and what cultures are being excluded and how we could more meaningfully include them, even if it's simply translating, in some sense, our existing procedural rules into non-Western contexts. So,
surely this is threatening, though, to some very powerful vested interests. So, for example, one of the bodies that does, in a sense, make rules is the United Nations, and the authority structure at the United Nations fundamentally hasn't changed since 1945. This is causing problems. There's an increasing sense that the Security Council's membership and structure is anachronistic and accordingly illegitimate. And yet, if you're Britain, if you're France, the United States, you don't really want to give up your permanent seat, you don't really want to give up your veto, and you don't really want to dilute it by adding additional permanent members either. You might not say publicly that you don't want to do it, but you really don't want to do it.
That's true, and this is why procedural rules are so fundamentally important, because they do structure the decision processes for primary rules in very fundamental ways, and it's difficult to really imagine wholesale revisions to secondary rules. It's absolutely right. And yet, the history of the international system, I think, suggests that we ignore that at our peril, and that we may actually be increasing substantially the risk of major systemic armed conflict if we are unwilling to take a look at our procedural rules.
Right. So in this case, it would be fair to say that the UN was just badly designed, badly set up, because nobody provided a mechanism for renovating membership rules and authority structures.
To some extent that's true, although I don't want to conclude by saying the situation is hopeless. There is a component of the UN that gets astonishingly little press and astonishingly little attention. They may like it that way, but the International Law Commission is a body at the UN, an expert body, which is tasked with updating and assisting states in updating fundamental rules of international law. And the ILC, I think, is an overlooked vehicle by which we might actually begin a long process of renovating these secondary rules. So I think that support for the ILC and its work at the expert level right now is probably the most immediate step that we can take, and asking the ILC to look at this issue of procedural rules in international law and diplomacy may turn out over the long run to be a very productive step.
Mm-hmm. And are there other places, other organizations, other parts of the world that you think are being particularly creative and forward-thinking about paying close attention to rules about rules?
It's a
European Union, perhaps, as they invent new forms of political organization?
I'm less optimistic about the EU. I think that it's looking like it may fly apart. The trouble of the euro over the last most recent period of economic trouble in the world more generally has sort of shown a rigidity in European Union rulemaking that is worrisome. Generally, though, I think the instinct of looking to regional organizations is a good one. We might be able, for instance, to look at ASEAN or the African Union as places of innovation and experimentation to some extent. But I think the ILC really is one of the most promising global venues for this kind of work.
Yeah, we'll have to keep our eye on that. Thank you for coming in and sharing your insights on your work, and we'll look for you again, I hope, in another season of the series. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. Join us again next week on Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.